When you need mealtime inspiration, it's worth shopping Baker's, where you'll find over 30,000 mouth-watering choices that excite your inner foodie. And no matter what tasty choice you make, you'll enjoy our everyday low prices, plus extra ways to save, like digital coupons worth over $600 each week. You can also save up to $1 off per gallon at the pump with fuel points. More savings and more inspiring flavors make shopping Baker's worth it every time. Baker's, fresh for everyone. Fuel restrictions apply.
You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Hey, pseudo-archaeology fans. This is Chris Webster, founder of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Jumping in with a quick note, the Archaeology Podcast Network has taken a break of releasing new episodes on all our feeds for the month of October. And in the place, we're giving you episodes that we think are valid from other shows on the network, so maybe you can find something else to listen to. This episode is from the Dirt Podcast. Check them out at arcpodnet.com, and you can find the Dirt logo down there and see their past episodes. And this episode is basically reviewing the older movie from, I don't know how long ago, called Apocalypto, and I thought this audience would enjoy that.
Hello, and welcome to The Dirt, a podcast about archaeology, anthropology, and our shared human past. I'm Anna.
And I'm Amber. How's everybody doing? No? Yeah, same here. All right. This week, the Summer Blockbusters series rolls on with the first film in my double feature, the bold and buzzy 2006 film Apocalypto, the fourth movie made by Academy Award-winning director and alleged human garbage can, Mel Gibson.
Is it buzzy because there's a lot of insects? Like buzzy, like it was talked about a lot?
Yeah, the latter.
Okay.
There are some insects in it.
Okay. Just thinking like rainforest. Ooh, buzzy.
I'll get to that part.
Okay.
About that fuzziness. So, Apocalypto. Are you familiar? Are you very familiar? Have you seen it? I guess that's the big one.
No, I definitely never saw it. I remember it coming out, and I remember the vague public response to it, and I imagine we'll get to that. So,
yeah,
it's a vague memory.
Yeah, and it could go either way, and we'll get to that.
Yeah,
so,
Apocalypto. I really just don't care for Mel Gibson.
Sure. Apocalypto was released when people were still not quite over his last movie, The Passion of the Christ, which
just starring the baffling Jim Caviezel.
Oh, yeah. Star of your favorite show.
No, star of the show I can't watch anymore because of now I know what Jim Caviezel is like.
It wasn't person of interest that was the problem.
No, I know that.
No, I mean that wasn't enough too. So it came out. So Passion of the Christ came out in 2004 and remains to this day the highest grossing R-rated film of all time.
Wow.
Like people went wild over it. Like specifically Christians and the ADL. They were the ones that went wild over it.
Okay. Yeah.
But somehow I managed to never see it despite being invited to screenings pretty much weekly for the second half of my high school career. It was the thing to see. Last week, Anna, you didn't spend much time talking about the plot of The Dig.
Because there wasn't much plot. They found a thing.
It's just sort of like very like it does what it says on the tin.
Yeah.
It's like they dig.
They do that.
But I think that in the case of Apocalypto, it would behoove all of us to know what exactly happens in Apocalypto, because I think it'll help our listeners understand where the critiques that we'll get into are coming from. Does that sound good?
That sounds great.
Okay. I wrote this synopsis.
Do you want me to read any of it?
You don't need to read you don't need to read the synopsis, but I have some quotes from reviews and interviews.
Oh, I get to contribute. Okay.
You can definitely contribute. But also I want to hear like your thoughts.
Oh boy.
Perhaps at the end of this, but I'll pause at the end of each paragraph. You can give me some thoughts.
You'll jaguar pause.
Yeah. Hey. Oh, Apocalypto. It was lauded, or at least received a ton of press for its predominantly indigenous cast, possibly entirely indigenous cast. It's not for me to say.
Didn't fact check every single person's blood quantum or whatever.
People tried to. Goodness.
Gosh.
The star, the like protagonist, played by Rudy Youngblood, who's just like a real cutie. He's like 20 and he's so young.
Oh gosh,
because it was 2006.
Yeah,
but, like
we were cuties.
Yeah, but there was some coverage being like, he's not indigenous, and I'm just like, whoa.
Slow your roll.
So, also all of the dialogue is in Yucatecan Maya.
Still a language.
Still a language. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so I did lose count of the number of times the subtitle said speaking in Mayan, sometimes over the like subtitles provided by the film. And I'm just like, I know.
Let me read them.
Yeah. Apocalypto focuses on Jaguar Paul, who is a young father and upstanding member of his village, who encounters an extremely freaked out man in the forest while hunting tapir one day in the early 16th century CE with his dad and bros.
Okay.
Jaguar Paul speaks on behalf of the hunting party and asks what the man wants, and is told that they want to pass through. They're looking for a new life after their village was destroyed. Jaguar Paul tells him and whoever we are to move along, and a huge group of traumatized and injured people, mostly elderly folks, women, and children, pass through. So this experience haunts Jaguar Paul later that evening during the feast and storytelling and general vibing that goes on in the community that night. He and his father have a conversation about it where his father is like, don't be afraid, like fear will infect you. It's like sort of like that's what you saw in those people. It was fear. And so he's just like kind of freaked out unsettled by the whole thing.
Sure.
I do want to mention that a not insignificant chunk of the first 20 minutes of this sort of like idyllic village life is spent with everybody bullying a guy who's known to be having trouble conceiving with his wife, including by his harpy mother-in-law who's nagging him about it. Like super weird way to endear me to our heroes, but go off, I guess.
They're just like us. Is that what you're trying for?
I don't know what was happening there, but there was some like some nice like familial intimacy going on with like Jaguar Paul and his dad, Jaguar Paul and his wife, Seven, who is pregnant. That is her personality, and his young child. So that they're cute. They're a nice little family. Okay. Early the next morning, Jaguar Paul wakes up from a nightmare in which the man he met in the forest is holding his own beating heart and then tells him to run.
I remember. Was that in the trailer?
I don't know.
That's just a really evocative description.
No, it's like his eyes are like quite wide and he's like like hyperventilating, and then he finally says run like while he's holding his heart. It's like it's a very striking image.
But I think it must have been in a trailer because
it would make sense to be in the trailer.
Yeah.
Early the next morning, Jaguar Paul, we said that. He wakes.
He has the nightmare.
Yeah,
and then wakes up.
He wakes only to see that a group of bloodthirsty warrior types have begun a sneak attack on the village. It's like quite crepuscular, and they've got torches, and they're like coming in. Jaguar Paul
Awful word for a nice time of day.
Jaguar Paul hides pregnant wife and young son in a narrow ravine pit thing, only to find himself among those tied up and lashed to long bamboo poles in a chain gang of sorts and marched into the forest, across a river, up the side of the mountain, and so forth. So
Mel Gibson just really likes movies about long, torturous walks.
Indeed.
What I'm getting.
So all of this that I just described to you takes the first hour of the movie. So I'm going to save you all of the gratuitous violence and misogyny because there's quite a bit of that. Just unlike those ladies. So as they continue onward, as so it's not only Jaguar Paul's community, but also the man he met the freaked out man in the forest and folks who had been with him, they've just been like abducted and are being trafficked. So they continue onward and encounter what seems like, I guess, deforestation, a person dead from smallpox, and a smallpox having child crying over their body. The child then becomes an oracle who tells them about how a man is coming to scratch out all the vile ones. The day will become like night. He'd run with the jaguar in their world. It's all very distressing. The group continues onward, passing through what I think is a lime processing quarry. Like everybody's like all white,
dusty.
It's very, it's a bit creepy in that way of just like sort of like that was like a nice cinematic. I don't know. Visually, it was evocative. So, and then it seems that these like conscripted laborers are making plaster, and they go through some ruined agricultural fields and enter a city-like place. It's got markets and women in cute shift dresses wearing like weaving, and people dyeing textiles, and there's visible inequality in the form of chic people on litters looking grossed out by the poors. I think that's what was happening in those scenes, like those shots. A classic Maya temple is being plastered and renovated because, you know, it's like anachronistic, but they're renovating it. So it's just old.
It just needed a refresh.
Yeah.
This is the historical society gussying it up.
Yeah. So it's sort of like a way to like fit in monumental architecture, but try to still make it like 16th century. Getting up to it, everyone is cut loose from their like bamboo shackles. Religious types come at the freshly cut free villagers with blue paint to smear over the men's bodies, while the women in the group are put on a platform and auctioned off as slaves. The harpy mother-in-law is turned loose because she's rendered worthless.
Great.
The men painted blue, including Jaguar Paul, are led down a corridor that has murals depicting blue men being led to a human sacrifice, which happen to be reproductions of real murals, just dating to 1700 years before the film takes place. So
that's okay. Like, the culture is static and hasn't changed in those 17.
That's like I guess the one like big one, like the one big issue.
Yeah.
Like
okay.
Of just like. But it's helpful because it does help you figure out what's going on in the movie.
Yeah.
Because then they open up onto a plaza of a kind of differently anachronistic temple, and a high priest is jauntily tossing heads down the side of the temple, like the steps, like a game of Plinko. So the high priest takes the stage and explains the premise of the movie, which is really helpful because at this point I had no idea what's going on. There's not a lot of dialogue, and the dialogue, and a good percentage of the dialogue that does exist is about that guy who can't get his wife pregnant. So it's
too bad.
A couple sacrifices happen, and then Jaguar Paul's turn comes up. The high priest lifts the blade, and so they're doing heart extractions and then decapitation. So that's the process. So he lifts the blade. And then a solar eclipse happens. And the king, who I only knew was the king because Amazon X-Ray was like, Raphael Veliz as king, was like, oh, can't sacrifice this guy. Cool Khan is all good on man blood today. The traffickers, who are described elsewhere as warriors, but they're just like people who have trafficked them. That seems to be their only job.
Just people stealers.
So the traffickers then take the remaining captives to what appears to be a ball court. But instead of playing ball, they play the most dangerous game. So they tell them to run like two at a time, and then they hunt them. So Jaguar Paul finishes off the finisher, whose job is to be at the end of the court to like brain anybody that gets that far. Yeah.
He's the goalie.
So he kills him, and then runs off into the cornfields. There are 38 minutes left of the movie.
How long is the total movie?
It is 2 hours and 8 minutes.
That's
before
so
you
much
get
of the
credits.
movie. Wow.
So this is how much time we spent. We spent the first hour
and
just
a
like
half.
we're almost there. Jaguar Paul breaks through the other side of the corn, hotly pursued by the trafficker guys, and then hides in up a tree, until they pass him by. He then realizes that he's up a tree between a baby jaguar and a mama jaguar, and so he starts running again. The traffickers are then attacked by a vicious jaguar puppet.
Realistic, huh?
It's
How are those jaguar effects?
just like, it's like shaking a muppet.
It's actually Triumph the comic dog.
It is what it looked like. Yeah. But I mean, that wasn't it. It took me out of it a little bit. Jaguar Paw keeps running, and one of the traffickers is like, "Oh, dang, that omen. We saw the day become like night. This jaguar puppet came out and ate our friend's brain. So I guess this guy is pretty scary. Like he's like the omen point."
Yeah.
So they keep
the
chasing
foretold.
him. Yeah. So they keep chasing him over a waterfall where at the bottom he's like, "I'm Jaguar Paul, son of Flint Sky. I'm a hunter. This is my forest." And then he keeps running and falls into a sinkhole and some quick mud. And in an admittedly extremely cool scene, he crawls out covered in black mud and is reborn in berserker mode.
Did they say anything in the film about reborn, or did you just choose to use that word?
That's kind of what's going on.
Okay, like symbolically,
he emerges like out
in
of
a
the
birthy
mud,
kind of
and
way.
He's all black, like he's like head to toe, like this, like it's just like a charcoal paste is what it looks like. And so he's just like
he's extremely activated.
Yes. And so he's like become the jaguar, and so it's this like
okay.
So it's like he's like, and this is a point where like things turn like in his favor because he's back home in his forest. And so it's like, it's my house. And it's very cool. A torrential storm begins overhead, and Jaguar Paul manages to take out a few of the trafficker people before getting back to the hole in which his pregnant wife
where
and
he
son,
stashed his family. Yeah.
So they've been hanging out in that hole like the whole movie, and it like occasionally goes back to them, like her using little ant heads as sutures on the little guy's foot, trying to escape, fighting off monkey puppets. That one was really bad. The monkey puppet was like actually bad. And then going into labor after multiple falls.
See the sticks on the arms.
So the storm is filling the hole with water.
Oh no.
And pregnant wife and child are in immediate peril. The head warrior closes in on Jaguar Paw. His son was the finisher that got finished. So it's like, now it's personal. And so the head warrior is like about to close in on him, but then trips the same wire for the trap that killed the tapir at the beginning of the movie. Chekhov's tapir trap. Pregnant wife has a water birth while standing on a rock with the child on her shoulders.
Standing?
Yeah, because she has to like get up on the rock because the water is filling up.
Okay, because it's
and
rising.
so like it is like bloop, and then there's like
it's the Nirvana album cover.
It's like the baby effects were like not great. There also was like
if they can't do jaguar and monkey.
I know. So whatever. I'm not taking issue with that. So Jaguar Paul makes it to the beach. Like he has to run off again because like shooters are chasing him. Yeah. So he makes it injured and exhausted with a couple of traffickers stumbling along behind him. And here, this is good scene. Good shot. When the camera closes in on his face, his eyes looking surprised, but not afraid. And then pulling back to see the two traffickers looking scared, and then panning around behind them to show what they're seeing. It's like 5 boats full of Spaniards, including a priest holding a huge crucifix, all coming at them. So Jaguar Paul runs back to the hole, now nearly full of water, and finds his wife and child and new baby with umbilical cord still attached.
Yeah, it's like a surfboard. You don't want to lose it if you fall off.
So the last scene of the movie is after the storm, when Jaguar Paul is walking up an embankment, carrying the baby with his son and wife coming up behind them. He stops and his wife joins him. They look out at the beach where the wife asks what the boats are and whether they should go to the men that were brought by said boats. Jaguar Paw says, no, we should go to the forest. So seek a new beginning. And they do. The end.
I feel like I just watched that whole movie.
Oh, man. My take on this movie is I really thought it would be better because I had heard a lot about how it was like gorgeous, like really sumptuous. And I was ready for that and I didn't get it. I appreciate the practical effects and the sets and the attention to jewelry and makeup and tattooing and like body modification processes that like are involved. Like it's like, that's really, really great. But like the forest didn't feel lush. The Temple Plaza didn't feel like oppressively hot and crowded. It didn't like apart from that penultimate scene that I was talking about, like in which Jaguar Paw is just like castle doctrining everybody in the forest before making it to the shore. It just like didn't get me there. It did not convey a strong enough sense of place to me. Okay. So another movie that came out in 2006, well, like December 2005, but like that was out in theaters in 2006 was Terrence Malick's The New World.
I missed that one too.
That's the one about John Smith and Pocahontas.
Oh no!
And
yep, okay.
It's beautiful, but it's Terrence, and so it won or was at least nominated for like cinematography, and that is a place that like really conveys the like beauty of the natural environment and sort of in a way that can be a bit much of just sort of like looking at like in indigenous land stewardship and sort of like a closeness to the land, like in that way that can get a little gross when it's white people talking about it and sort of fetishizing it a bit. But it's beautiful. Like it's beautiful. And it has a sense of place that this kind of lacked, which is a shame given what was invested in it in terms of like but however, a character actually says, I'm walking here. And Yucatec and Maya when a tree falls down in front of him. And that's fun. It's like a little bit of Midnight Cowboy.
Just one little moment of like,
just like a weird, like, I'm walking here.
Hey.
But people liked it. There were several like filmmakers who were like, this is the best movie of the decade, which is insane because The New World also came out. And it's just sort of like, what if you have like two movies in like the same genre of like Europeans encountering indigenous people in the Americas, and they came out the same time, and one of them is gorgeous and the other one is hyperviolent in a gross way. But that's not what we're talking about. So according to Rotten Tomatoes, it has a 65% critic score and a 79% audience score. And the critics' consensus is, quote, Apocalypto is a brilliantly filmed, if mercilessly bloody, examination of a once great civilization, end quote. And that consensus is pretty accurate to what the movie seems to be trying to do. In fact, the very first image of the film after the production logos is a black screen with a white text that reads, quote,
a great civilization is not conquered from without until it has destroyed itself from within.
And that is from Will Durant, who is the co-author of The Story of Civilization. He's credited as the author of it, but his wife also wrote it. And that is, are you familiar with The Story of Civilization?
No, but I just read this list of chapters.
Yeah, this is an 11-volume set.
Oh, no.
That looked at the history of civilization. And so it was really popular in like book clubs, and like it was like a big like popular history meet push. So Anna, would you like to read what those 11 volumes of The Story of Civilization
set of white guys?
Not just white guys.
No, but boy.
Chapter volume 1.
Okay, so I'm so sorry. Yes. Volume 1, Our Oriental Heritage.
So that's the Sumerians up through the fall of the Achaemenid.
It makes me feel Empire. A little better that was 1935. Not a lot better.
Kept going for 40 years.
Yeah, well. Volume 2, The Life of Greece. Volume 3, Caesar and Christ. Volume 4, The Age of Faith. Volume 5, The Renaissance. Volume 6, The Reformation. One side of the world is tipping the scales a little bit. Volume 7, The Age of Reason begins. Volume 8, The Age of Louis XIV. The pause was for me to figure out what those Roman numerals added up to.
Of Louis Xib.
Volume 10, Rousseau and Revolution.
You missed one.
Oh, sorry. How could I? Volume 9, The Age of Voltaire. Volume 10, Rousseau and Revolution. Volume 11, The Age of Napoleon. Very French heavy in the last.
Very French heavy. Yeah.
Last part of things.
And so those books, those volumes were published between 1935 and 1975. He obviously talked a lot about civilization. And so it's fascinating to me that this quote would be this like very Jared Diamond-y quote.
It's very victim blamey also.
Because if you look at like what's being discussed in this, it's sort of like the march towards reason, the march towards democracy.
Using that quote at the beginning of this movie is like, well, the reason that this quote unquote collapse happened is it's their fault. It's their own fault that they were conquered.
Oh, interesting. You should say that, Anna. Because the idea of civilizations in decline, or perhaps passing the baton to someone new, or perhaps hanging around past their prime, comes through in what I could find from the screenwriters themselves, Mel Gibson and Farhad Safina, who's a guy that has a degree in math.
Wow.
Yeah. So math majors, here's what you can do. I'm going to have Anna read a quote from a 2006 column from the Hollywood Reporter, which was then syndicated in the Washington Post. Anna.
Quote, Safina and Gibson chose the Mayan civilization as their historical point in time for several reasons. They wanted to explore a pre-Columbian, pre-European native culture, and they chose the Mayans over the Aztecs because of their sophistication and swift downfall. Safina says, quote, the Mayans were far more interesting to us. You can choose a civilization that is bloodthirsty, or you can show the Mayan civilization that was so sophisticated with an immense knowledge of medicine, science, archaeology, and engineering, but also be able to illuminate the brutal undercurrent and ritual savagery that they practiced. It was a far more interesting world to explore why and what happened to them, end quote.
Yeah. And then at a film festival screening that year, so this was in 2006, Gibson compared the setting of the film to the then 3-year-old Iraq War, saying, quote, the precursors to a civilization that's going under are the same time and again. What's human sacrifice if not sending guys off to Iraq for no reason? To an extent, yeah, I'm here for. I'm not neither here for the Iraq War nor human sacrifice.
You are appreciating the metaphor.
Like thinking about if we are to consider what is considered like ritualized human sacrifice, like an argument could be made that like the treatment of like people in the service industry since the beginning of the pandemic, like that's something that could be seen from an edict perspective, so an external perspective, as a form of sacrifice. So like, okay, fine. And honestly, like that stuff was one of the least problematic things that Gibson said that year, because 2006 was Mel Gibson's Slur speed run.
Yeah,
that was
I remember
that was the year that he was just like going for it. So let's take a break, and then when we come back, I want to dig in a little bit more about into what Apocalypto is doing and how its violence might extend beyond what happens on screen.
Save on O'Reilly Brake Parts Cleaner. Get 2 cans of O'Reilly Brake Parts Cleaner for just $8. Valid in-store only at O'Reilly Auto Parts.
O'Reilly Auto Parts.
What makes for a great vacation? Depends on who you ask. Are you looking to get away or bring everyone together? Do you want to get outside and play or see a play at the plate? Fortunately, however you operate, I'm the destination you've been looking for. The name's Missouri, but you can call me Mo. And I have just one question. What's your MO? Come see me at visitmo.com.
We're back. Let's get into critical response to the film within academic circles, because that's what you came here for, I bet. So there are plenty of reviews that panned it as like inaccurate or racist, just sort of like, and lots of things that are like kind of in the scheme of things nitpicky. The way
sort
that
of
like
surface level,
like somebody being like, well, like if it were a solar eclipse, it wouldn't happen in the few minutes. It would take hours. But it's like, yeah, it's a movie, and like that kind of stuff. Or the people being like, oh, there's a classic Maya temple there, and it's like in the post-classic, like proto-historic period, like
they still have them.
They were still there.
They were still there. They're really big.
They're big and they stay there. And so like, yeah, it might not be new and like, but also
and they were replastering.
Well, yeah, which like fair enough. Like I'm like good for you. Like I'm glad you, but also like it isn't as impressive visually to somebody watching a movie if it's just like a flat open space. Like, yeah, it's harder to get like a crowd and a guy if they're all like on the same level. So like stuff like that, where it's like, oh, come on. Like, that's the thing you're mad about. Like, just sort of like when we have bigger fish to fry, the fish to fillet, weird, bigger fish to fillet. So one critique that I think tackles the issues that I think are most important comes from Tracy Ardren, who in writing for Archaeology magazine is Apocalypto pornography. Because that was the word that came to me while I was watching, as being like, this is pornographic. Like murder porn? Yeah, it's just like just violent and like not and the traffickers are like kind of cartoonishly villainous. Like this would be like, I'm crazy, like I'm a crazy guy. And it's just like messing with people and stuff like that. And it's just like, is this a religious thing? Like, are you getting sacrificed? It's like for a holy purpose. Like, are you like trying to like turn a profit off of human? Like, what are you doing?
What's your motive?
Like, some like one of the characters is just like, oh, he's just like the wild card and like in the outfit. And it's just like, what?
Sure.
Ardren says, Anna will read what Ardren says. Sorry.
Quote, Gibson's efforts at authenticity of location and language might, for some viewers, mask his blatantly colonial message that the Maya needed saving because they were rotten at the core. Using the decline of classic urbanism as his backdrop, Gibson communicates that there was absolutely nothing redeemable about Maya culture, especially elite culture, which is depicted as a disgusting feast of blood and excess. Before anyone thinks I have forgotten my Metamucil this morning... Fiber's important. I am not a compulsively politically correct type who sees the Maya as the epitome of goodness and light. I know the Maya practiced brutal violence upon one another, and I have studied child sacrifice during the classic period. But in Apocalypto, no mention is made of the achievements in science and art, the profound spirituality and connection to agricultural cycles, or the engineering feats of Maya cities. Instead, Gibson replays in glorious big-budget Technicolor an offensive and racist notion that Maya people were brutal to one another long before the arrival of Europeans, and thus they deserve, in fact they needed, rescue. This same idea was used for 500 years to justify the subjugation of Maya people, and it has been thoroughly deconstructed and rejected by Maya intellectuals and community leaders throughout the Maya area today. In fact, Maya intellectuals have demonstrated convincingly that such ideas were manipulated by the Guatemalan army to justify the genocidal civil war of the 1970s through 1990s. To see this same trope about who indigenous people were and are today, used as the basis for entertainment, and I use the term loosely, is truly embarrassing. How can we continue to produce such one-sided and clearly exploitative messages about the indigenous people of the New World? I loved Gibson's film Braveheart, I really did. But there is something very different about portraying a group of people who are now recovering from 500 years of colonization as violent and brutal. These are people who are living with the very real effects of persistent racism that at its heart sees them as less than human. To think that a movie about the 1,000 ways a Maya can kill a Maya, when only 10 years ago, Maya people were systematically being exterminated in Guatemala just for being Maya, is in any way okay, entertaining, or helpful is the epitome of a Western fantasy of supremacy that I find sad and ultimately pornographic. It is surely no surprise that Apocalypto has very little to do with Maya culture, and instead is Gibson's comment on the excesses that he perceives in modern Western society. I just wish he had been honest enough to say this. Instead, he has created a beautiful and disturbing portrait that satisfies his need for comment, but does violence to one of the most impressive of Native American cultures. End quote.
That's so like when I like the sort of nitpicky and pedantic corrections and like complaints that people have, like that kind of stuff makes me mad because they are missing the point. And the point is the one that Ardron's making there.
Yes.
Of just being like,
this is actively harming the community that still is there.
Yeah. And so an alternative position is voiced in Richard Hanson's chapter, Relativism, Revisionism, Aboriginalism, and Emic Truth, the case study of Apocalypto.
Too long. Your title's too long.
So that chapter is in a book called The Ethics of Anthropology and Amerindian Research, Reporting on Environmental Degradation and Warfare. And just as a little refresher or fresher, if you haven't heard this before, so he talks about emic and edic. So emic is an anthropological term that refers to, it is a description of an event or a situation that is coming from within. So it's based on the perceptions of the observed group. So emic coming from, so you emit something. Mm-hmm. It's coming from within. So edic is coming from without, which is based on the perceptions of the external observer. So the ethnographer, the archaeologist, the scientist, like that. And so
unless they are of the descendant community by default, it's an edic perspective. Yes.
And then like if they are a part of the descendant community, there are tensions. There stand to be tensions. So it's important to note here.
And a emetic makes you barf.
Coming from within. So it's important to note here that Hanson was involved in the production of the film as a consultant.
Oh.
Yeah. And so the most interesting to me aspect of the entire chapter was the inclusion of his own photos of the city set and information about all of the research and detail that went into creating the setting and development of the film. Not much of that makes it to the screen, much less to the foreground of the audience's experience. So did you ever see the show Rome? The HBO program
I watched
Rome?
The first couple seasons.
Well, so all of them.
Oh, I don't know how many there are. I just remember like watching, I don't know, a handful of episodes.
Okay, so you know how they are real sets, and like it's all like very like richly informed by like archaeological
good world building.
So apparently the same thing happened for Apocalypto, and you just don't see it. So Hanson does speak to that when he says, quote,
"It is easy to lament the lack of additional examples of Maya achievements in Apocalypto, such as ball games, written script, dancing, the theater, theater, rogue hyphen, and extensive trade networks. The sophistication of the cityscape, the economic and social activities visible in the film, the elaborate architecture, and the prognostication of the eclipse in Apocalypto implied an extraordinary cultural complexity. The extensive detail built into the cityscapes at Veracruz would have allowed a greater insight into the economic, social, and political sophistication of the Maya, and it is unfortunate that more of the art, architecture, and the detailed cultural remains did not see more film time." End quote. So he's saying, like, it's not my fault.
Yeah, it's like so this was in response to Ardrin and others' comments, because I think this came out in 2007. So this was like a full year after it came out. His chapter came out.
Time to compose a response.
Yeah, and or just to get it through the editing process of an edited journal. There's nothing about spirituality or engineering or sort of agricultural knowledge. Like there's no science. There's no science, and there's no like interiority. And he's like, it's all there, but it is a shame you didn't see it. But largely, Hansen's chapter is dedicated to countering academic outcry about the film with a review of evidence that the late post-classic and proto-historic Maya society was violent. They did conduct human sacrifice via decapitation and heart extraction. There were areas where hunter-gatherer groups could still lived. And there is evidence for slavery. And you can't argue with the fact that the Spanish did show up, and the movie isn't saying that they're the saviors at all. So just saying a lot of stuff where I think what I see as willfully misunderstanding what people have an issue with and picking straw men. And I think it's really interesting to have something from the mid-aughties about this, because this is the same kind of stuff that we see today, but there's no economy of language in calling something woke or saying someone's canceled in like this chapter and in his like similarly minded colleagues. Instead, Hansen puts forward that critics of Apocalypto are engaging in historical revisionism, an attempt to whitewash Maya history and to like virtue signal that Mel Gibson is bad and indigenous people are good. And that because he does say that like most people didn't have good, they ignored the evidence that this stuff was be like, well, like what's historical accuracy? Like it's fiction. These things did happen in the archaeological record and in history and in all of these Spanish texts that I'm quoting to corroborate
you are
these
surely
ideas.
Unbiased.
It's like, and so this guy like is, I think his work is like Olmec stuff, but like he's a faculty member in the anthropology department. Like, but Lord knows that doesn't stop him. This kind of thinking.
There was someone I was going to mention when you were starting to talk about Richard Hansen. I was like, oh, this is real so-and-so energy. And then I looked and you mentioned them 2 paragraphs down.
Yeah. So we'll get there. Same vibe. Using the same juice.
Bad juice.
Hansen says, quote,
in some cases, revisionist perspectives ignore the vast amounts of data that have accumulated over periods of time and seek to promote that which is ideologically expedient or politically correct or convenient within the bounds of language. In other cases, a certain movement purports that indigenous rights should always trump scientific inquiry. Such positions defy the establishment of truth.
That's a quote.
Yes,
so he is
citing
quoting
Zimmerman.
So he's quoting someone else who cited Zimmerman et al. 2003. So indigenous rights should always trump scientific inquiry is something that he is quoting.
When was NAGPRA passed? Was it 90 or 95?
90.
1990. Okay, so this is 13 years after.
Bro, we're 30 years past.
No, I know. That is what I was trying to articulate, and then my brain ground to a stop.
Don't worry. He's not done talking.
Such positions defy the establishment of truth and seek for an unqualified political correctness that is both unwarranted and dangerous to the realities of the human saga. On a more subtle note, it can lull a society into an intellectual complacency, generating a moral and intellectual failure to acknowledge or improve on mistakes or violations of accepted values of universal human rights. End quote.
So this idea that he's talking about here and this kind of work of this idea of saying like factually all the things that happened in this movie are borne out in evidence. And you just don't want to admit it because you think that by acknowledging the reality of like ritualized and systemic violence, you are just like feeling guilty. It's your white guilt. Also, he references Alex Jones and Paul Joseph Watson because they said that it was like the most important movie of like all time or something. And Alex Jones is still talking about, is still citing things that happen in Apocalypto today. Like within the past few weeks.
In this year of 2022.
In 2022 as archaeological data, as sort of looking at like civilizations in decline and stuff like that.
Oh, he's looking at Apocalypto as data?
Yeah.
Oh no.
Like he like viewing it as like literature, as like as scientific literature.
A text, a rich text.
I finally figured out what it was, because he like always talks about it. I'm just like, where's he getting this? Like, where is he getting, what did he see? And he saw Apocalypto in 2006 and he thought it was great. And so
all right.
All of this stuff and Hansen's ideas are just one of the many crumbs on the path that led us to the work and notoriety of people like Elizabeth Weiss, who is an anthropologist, who
is the person I alluded to 2 paragraphs ago.
And who like, and then folks in this, like the intellectual dark web types, believe that respecting descendant communities and indeed like the lives and like memory of people who once occupied the bodies, whose remains that they now study, letting them be a part of the conversation and in fact get to decide what happens to their relations, is a direct attack on her ability to do science. And it amounts to science bending to religion. Because seeing this idea of like political correctness, like gone mad kind of thing.
Right, this idea that it's standing in the way of progress or knowledge. It's
and elsewhere in this article, Hansen's like, oh, and then this guy, he says that like objective reality, it isn't even a thing. And I was just like, it's not. Just like, that's. But just like and like he tried to get into like the philosophy of science, like down. It was just sort of like, you saying that Apocalypto is bad is because you want people to know that you think that Mel Gibson should be punished for saying anti-Semitic things. And so you don't want to admit that it's a good movie and it's accurate because you don't want to hurt Indigenous people's feelings. That's my first sign of be like, are you friends with him? And I think he is. So Hansen, elsewhere in this chapter, Hansen quotes a paper presented at the 2007 AAA session critiquing Apocalypto, an anthropological response to the perpetuation of inequality in popular media, which Ardren was a part of. But this paper comes from Alan Maka and Kevin McLeod, who say, quote,
possibly Kevin McLeod, quote, Mel Gibson's Apocalypto, while it may seem on the surface to be another mindless, violent action epic with the Maya as unwitting casualties, actually sets out to achieve similar goals, an exploration of consciousness and of modern man's need for renewal and transformation. Like most films involving or based on native culture, yet made by non-natives, Apocalypto is a grandiose and intricately nuanced commentary on white society. Because the hero and the villains are indigenous, however, the film also seeks to explore the basis of our humanity, regardless of race and ethnicity. The artistic devices Gibson uses to communicate his ideas draw heavily on tropes, symbols, and plot lines developed by earlier masters, but he also clearly develops and adopts themes and symbolic values that are basic to myth and ritual. End quote. What? What?
So I think that
what?
That is being taken here as a good thing. That,
like, using it as commentary?
Yeah, that it's commentary. So like he's doing something here. It's something bigger than that. He's not talking about Mayans. He's not saying that. Also calling them Mayans. Like, it's just sort of like he's like he's doing something. And the fact that this is taken as a good thing is like a huge problem.
Yeah.
It's perhaps
very troubling.
It's perhaps the problem that I have. And that is that Indigenous people are not a metaphor for human nature.
Especially that idea of like the primal human. Like, no,
right.
Stop that.
And also like Indigenous people have their own stories. And like they're and also like
maybe they should make the movies.
It's really complicated because there's this like sort of organization like the First Americans in the Arts. And Mel Gibson won an award from them this year the film won an award. Like Rudy Youngblood won an award, like because of it. And like two of the public screenings were for predominantly Native audiences. Like I think there was one that was on Chickasaw Nation. And so it's this weird, it's something that like yucks me out because it feels like very like pan Native. And that like none of the like leading actors, like none of the like the people with like speaking roles and stuff.
What about the Hey, I'm Walking Here guy?
I think that was Raul Trujillo, who is not Maya, but also was in the New World and was the choreographer for all of the dances that were done in the New World.
Oh, cool.
He was a dancer before actor. Like, so he's like a dancer and choreographer and an actor. And so he was in both of those movies. But I don't think anyone's Maya. You've just got this guy who's like Yaqui and Cree. Unless you talk to that one guy who wrote an article. It's like, oh yeah. And it's like, whoa,
chill.
And
why don't you make a movie about the excesses of the rich and European and white? Like, why not just do that? Why make it a Maya metaphor?
Yeah, like if you're going to go to all the trouble of making all these things historically accurate, which were gorgeously
presumably
done,
hiring Richard Hansen,
which like he wasn't even like the biggest contributor to it, it seems. But like if you're going to go to all that trouble, why don't you tell a Maya story? There is a Maya story in it. There's the village the night before the raid, there's like an elder who is telling a story, and it's a traditional, I don't know if it's a Yucatecan story, but it's a traditional Mesoamerican folk story. It was like edited by somebody who is like a philologist.
Okay.
And the script was translated by a Maya linguist. Well, I don't know if he's Maya. He is a Mexican national. But
Maya languages.
But he is like a big guy in a sort of like Maya linguistics.
Okay.
And so like, if you go to all this trouble, why don't you tell a Maya story? If you want to have an intricately nuanced commentary on white society, why not do it in white society or in the animal world? Like Animal Farm managed to do that really well. You've already got the puppets.
Yeah, you got monkeys, you got jaguars.
Oh, that
what else do you need?
So we're going to take one more break. And when we come back, we're going to spend our last few minutes together today talking about some archaeology from the early 16th century during this time of initial contact between the Maya and Europeans, like in the real world.
America. We are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. At Grand Canyon University, we believe in equal opportunity, and the American dream starts with purpose. By honoring your career calling, you impact your family, your friends, and your community. The pursuit to serve others is yours. Find your purpose at Grand Canyon University. Private, Christian, affordable. Visit gcu.edu.
We're back.
Hi.
As I promised mere moments ago, I want us to take a look at some like real archaeology of the Maya at the time of Spanish contact and colonization, sort of telling its own story and not being like a bunch of Barbies like used to tell another story, which is like kind of how it's just like really, really infuriating.
Yeah, it's using them as props, using people as props.
Purely as props. In doing so, we're going to push a little further past the idea of the Maya being a once great civilization, which also is like some sort of like the Dirt 101 stuff. So I'm not going to like do any like much of like the remedial, like it wasn't a collapse kind of thing, but pushing us into the realm of the Maya homeland being a heterogeneous site of like resistance and fluctuation for the past couple millennia, including the 16th century CE. So in the 2016 Antiquity article, The Perduring Maya, New Archaeology on Early Colonial Transitions.
I had to look up the perjuring Maya. No, I looked up perduring. It's existing for a long period of time.
It's just enduring, but formal.
Yeah, perduring.
Authors Maxine Oland and Joel W. Palka move away from that monolithic Maya got conquered worldview and break up the archaeological literature concerning the period of contact and early Spanish colonialism into like circumstance-defined zones.
That's interesting.
It's really, really interesting. And to further everyone's interest, I'm going to have Anna quote the article as to what these zones are. There's 3 of them.
Quote, conquered zones, areas that were controlled by the Spaniards and organized into congregaciones, which are new Spanish settlements inhabited by relocated Maya, with forced labor, reorganization of domestic and social space, forced religious conversion, and the oversight of friars and Spanish officials. And then there are peripheral semi-conquered zones, organized into encomiendas, which is conquistador control over regional units of Maya labor, with visita missions, but administered primarily through indirect rule by existing elites. And then unconquered zones, beyond the Spanish colonial periphery, and able to survive the historic period without colonization. End quote.
So those are the 3 zones. And they point out like even those zones. So they're saying like, not only is it not like a monolith, it's also like those 3 zones aren't cut and dry. Conquered zones found ways for cultural continuity in their personal lives, their communities, and sort of their like cosmology. And some people in semi-conquered zones adopted more Spanish material culture and social mores, despite there not being much Spanish presence in their daily lives. Because it just came to them through like more diffusive practices and being like, okay, I'll do that. And then unconquered zones, that's a real misleading perhaps name, because they were very much impacted by what was happening, because they saw movements of displaced people and refugees like into their territories. And they would have seen impacts on trade, and they would have gotten sick like from the illnesses that are spreading. Because I think we talked about in some episode at some point in the 23 years that we've been doing this, we talked about how it was like by the time the Spanish arrived,
their smallpox had
everybody
arrived before them.
Yeah, like it because
people were dead and dying. Yeah,
yeah. I think it was like in the Inca heartland. It was just sort of like. It was
because of the system of roads.
Yeah. Like it was like
people
it was
traveled carrying the disease, etc.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so like the depopulation through sickness had already happened before they even got there. The full article is available on ResearchGate, and I have it linked in the show notes. And if this is at all interesting to you, I really recommend you check it out. It does a great job. It does a really great job of demonstrating that processes like contact and colonization aren't straightforward, swift actions, but are a complex web of messy, interdependent conditions and interactions. And to wrap up, I want to share an older than that article. So that article that we just talked about was in 2016. This one is from 94. And it does take kind of a holistic approach to geography and time. But I think for our purposes here, it's still fruitful. So author Mario Humberto Ruz describes several routes and methods in Maya resistance to colonial rule in everyday life. So this is a bit later than Jaguar Paw et al. Ruz sort of categorizes this along the lines of social organization, economy, family structure, and religion. I just want to like give you kind of some quick hits of just like interesting ways in which the Maya found spaces in which to resist and what that could look like. So in social organization, you talked about it a little bit in sort of the conquered zones where people were basically forcibly relocated into like more urban environments to like keep an eye on them and to like extract labor from them and make sure that they weren't being sinful. People regularly fled the towns they were organized into. They burned them to the ground and then booked it. They requested royal permission to relocate.
Going through appropriate channels.
Yeah, like just sort of being like,
I don't like this.
Can I go? Yeah. And then just moving away en masse. And so it became like it got to a point in, I think in like what later became Belize, that the Spanish officials were like, okay, we got to try it again. But they basically like no one lived in the towns. The towns were just vacant. And so they kind of had to like build new towns to like round everybody up and put into again. Cause they just like were not, they were like
a toddler
in no way
who
compliant.
doesn't want to go for a nap. Just like, no, but you know, like a lot bleaker.
Yeah. So in terms of economy, Yucatecans refused to grow surplus corn. They just like refused to grow more and then they're just like, we won't be doing that. And that led the Spanish to have to create their own agricultural fields, which like, of course, were tended by conscripted Yucatecan labor.
Love that list.
They had to like,
it made their day harder.
They had to go. Yeah. They had to go. Yeah. They had to go to additional work because they were just like, I mean, why would I make more? Resistance. It is a form of resistance.
Yeah. They're providing friction.
In what became Guatemala, Maya stopped growing corn altogether and they switched to a foraging based diet. And so they just made a decision to just like stop growing it because they aren't going to be exploited. So they like started eating a lot in the way of like roots and just like foraging. Sure. Yeah. In mines, in agricultural settings. They were conscripted and enslaved workers, were like treated horribly apart from the fact that they were conscripted and enslaved. Yeah. This is like the baseline. And so they frequently staged revolts, killed their overseers, or in cases where they lacked community support, they resisted in the form of dying by suicide, of just being like, you won't get any more labor out of me. Mm-hmm. I thought those were very interesting. Just being like, no one's like, oh no, like they're just like, no, how do we keep this going? Yeah. So the family structure was very much altered under Spanish colonization. They had a focus on cutting out sexual behavior, altogether, and rebranding it as sin, and enforcing monogamy and shifting from patrilocal to nuclear families because they were like, it gets too polygamous and it's weird.
It does sound Catholic.
Yeah. So new clothing was introduced to replace traditional dress with an eye for modesty, as well as identifying where the indigenous people were originally from. And so they were wearing otherwise Hispanic peasant looking attire. Yeah. Nothing that you could get horny about.
No, like a sack, like a sort of burlap sack situation.
Yeah. But not just any burlap sack. Maya managed to weave like lineage symbols and like historical and mythological motifs into their frumpy clothing. And they found a way to like and what Ruse says, to integrate such costumes into their cultural universe. So they took them on and kind of made them Mayan. And then one last thing about sort of family structure comes in the form of names. And so
I like this one a lot.
The cultural erasure that happens with basically not being allowed to continue to use Mayan names, and imposing Christian, like specifically Christian, but like Christian Hispanic names. Yeah. And so they Mayanized them. Yeah. So Pedro became Petul, Juan became Shun, Maria became Mala, and Isabel became Jepel, and so on.
That is awesome.
It's like,
that's great.
Yeah. Of being like, well,
if I have, you know what, we'll just work with it. Work with what we're forced to work with.
Yeah. And so, which brings us to the point of religion. So there are like two main ways of sort of resisting under colonization in terms of religion. One is by having so it's sort of like sublimating their religion. Yeah, like making their religion subtext to the religion that's imposed upon them. So having coded language, hidden rites, underground beliefs, and like prayer in secret. So like stuff that happens like in their own homes, in their own minds, like and sort of.
I mean, I went to Hebrew school. I am aware of analogous situations.
Yeah, and so also the concept of syncretism, where people who are in like minority faiths and majority faith contexts, or just like points of cultural contact and exchange of pulling elements from one cultural tradition and sort of fitting it into yours with respect to religion. So the idea of like Bridget becoming Saint Bridget, and like you hear stuff like Catholicism loves to do this.
Yeah, and in the Maya, we actually just talked about this on Old News, but the Maya the maize god is sacrificed every year and is reborn. So I imagine, like, in talking about sort of Christianity, the idea of rebirth, like, it's easy to draw parallels and kind of make those things work together.
Yeah, and so Roos points out that this was made a bit easier by the existence of sort of parallels between Mayan and Christian religious concepts. So they were able to sort of be like, okay, sure, yeah, I'm doing this. But still, by modifying your expression of faith to be a bit more palatable to your oppressor,
something that won't get you, hurt or killed.
Yeah, and so over time, your faith, the faith that you're expressing, may shift towards that, but it isn't. You're not being apostate about it. And then in the last point that I want to bring here, which I think is a good way to bring it on home, is what Roos categorizes under resistance and redefinition. Anna.
Quote, "A great part of the highest knowledge that only the initiated possessed disappeared when these individuals died. In fact, the culture of the elite was condemned due to its relation with the structure of power and religion, but the common people had the necessary flexibility to resist the clash and to adapt to the changes. The enterprise was to endure, or perdure, and thus to contrive the mechanisms by which to survive. The loss could be recovered, and that which was created once could be recreated. In keeping the sign, perhaps the meaning could be recovered later." End quote.
And I think that that's a great place to end today, on a note of continuity and survival. So as usual, it's not a matter of collapse, and civilization remains a subjective and arguably useless metric for evaluating the world around us and perhaps opening a movie with.
Thank you for watching this so I didn't have to.
I'm disappointed in it. I wasn't surprised by most of it. I thought it'd be more beautiful.
Yeah.
I should have just watched The New World again and been like, I'd like to think that I kind of recovered, because I was like, what do I do with this? Like, what do I do with this movie that I said I'd watched? And I did this with it.
Yeah, I think you did a really excellent job of sort of pointing out what the big problem is. Because I think maybe a lot of people presented with even just like the synopsis of this movie would have critiques, but might not see the big picture and like the idea that this is actively doing harm, and the idea that this is something that unbelievably is still quoted by Alex Jones. Like, clearly it had
that's something
a
that,
significant knock-on effect into
like within the past few months, he's talked about this of just sort of like looking at like civilizations like falling because, ours is going to, because of globalists at all. And so like, it's something that has like, it has stuck around.
Yeah.
And the issues with it have nothing to do with the fact that Mel Gibson is an anti-Semite.
I mean, it doesn't help. and it's sort of a reflection of,
and they're complementary.
Yeah. The idea of people who can view other people as subhuman.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, sorry, you wanted to end on a note of continuity and survival, and I brought it down. So,
I mean, what better case is there for continuity and survival than the career of Alex Jones?
Got him. Zing.
So we've got one more main feed summer blockbuster to come, and that's me again. I hope that it won't be an hour of me telling you not to watch a movie.
It might.
Yeah, it might.
Yeah, but for our patrons who received the newsletter, you can all just go, oh.
But until then, dearest listener.
Until then, you can find us, all of our nearly 200 episodes, days of listening. You can find all of that at thedirtpod.com, our website, where you can also find merch and material for educators and our Pass the Mic small grants program. You can find all of that at thedirtpod.com along with all of our social feeds. But if you want to do that separately, you can find us on Facebook at The Dirt Podcast. On Instagram, we are at The Dirt Pod. And on Twitter, we're at Dirt Podcast. And we really appreciate you, all of you. The reviews you leave, the fact that you spend your time listening to us. Wild. That's wild. It's so
really
great.
Nice.
It's really nice.
Much appreciated.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. We love you. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
This episode was produced by Chris Webster from his RV traveling the United States, Tristan Boyle in Scotland, DigTech LLC, Culturo Media, and the Archaeology Podcast Network.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
Stay cool and choose from over 40 in-stock ceiling fans for under $100, plus an 11% rebate at Menards. We carry the largest selection of in-stock Hunter ceiling fans, available in a variety of designs, finishes, and features. Create the perfect look and lighting for any room with a new Hunter ceiling fan. Visit Menards.com and view our entire selection of Hunter ceiling fans, plus the weekly flyer and other great deals going on now.
Save